Hey, welcome. This is Dr. John Bush. This is the process continuing my lessons for the 2022 season. This is lesson 122. Please go back and see the previous lessons if you've just joining me. This is tight end deep metrics. And in previous discussions, I've talked about my use of top-down analysis that meets the bottom-up analysis, and I think you get a deeper understanding of the metrics using this approach. So every year I do this work. Very curious about our positions changing in usage and variability, uncertainty. These are things that I'm going to have to every year update. So every year you can come back and find out kind of what the latest outcome is. I've got 3 lessons on tight ends and much less to go over than running backs because tight ends are not rushers. Okay, so they're pass catchers. And that makes, in some ways, a little bit more straightforward, but we still have data and metrics and conclusions to go through. So let's continue our journey here. Okay, so this is the next slide, and we're looking across the last 21 years. Again, I think it's essential to have a big landscape view of the metrics. We cannot afford to be very myopic in our view. In other words, just looking at last year. I think that is the lowest common denominator out there. A lot of analysts don't go so far back. That's not where you're going to get with me, but this requires some thinking, and it's definitely not for most in fantasy football. So I appreciate you wanting to go above the minimum, but let's face it, most people, just, give me the wood and I'll chop, go get the fire. And I feel like we all need to understand how to chop the wood first, the whole process, then you can get to burning the fire. So, and in life, as a college professor, a lot of students just, what do I need to know for the test? And the ones that are going to be the best doctors and vets and pharmacists that I've had over the years, they want to understand the whole show. And frankly, these are the ones who I would let treat my family, right, or my pets. And so, you can have the slackers and the let me slide through, the looters of the world, or you can have those who want to work. And unfortunately, a lot of people can get away with just sliding across here, and that's just not who I am, and do not support that journey in one's life. Okay, so we have the years. And I wanted to have the count of tight ends that were in each year database. And this is something that's definitely changed in the league. We're to the point where in the early 2000s, most teams had let's see, 30 teams, about 3 tight ends. So we're talking 87, 89, 90 tight ends, 88. And now we're going to 5 tight ends on average last year, say 144 divided, by 30 or so. It's close. So we've doubled roughly the number of tight ends that the league is carrying. So that's going to have implications. So there's been a passing tight end versus a blocking tight end versus a red zone tight end. So there's been a diversification a little bit in the tight end position. So we, in our drafting and tight end premium leagues, you do need to understand that. And sometimes with injury, some primary tight end blockers types actually have to shift over and become more or attempt to get pass catchers. So it's best to kind of understand the hierarchy in each team. So, we're not to that point yet in the season. That's later in the summer. But not all tight ends will be the pass catching type. And if you think about, and my partner, DMC Dennis, who does the Science of Fantasy podcast here, leads that podcast actually. His comment was, and it just kind of hit me like, duh, thanks, Dennis, that all tight ends only prosper in a tight end premium if they're big pass catchers versus those that are catching a touchdown, and that's determining their weekly value. And so that is something that I'm going to pay attention to. Hey, come here. I'm talking. In the drafts here. So who are the pass catching? And they'll be the ones that really are going to have the extra premium. So that creates a level of tight ends that have more value in a tight end premium situation. So we have 87 in the year 2000 that were in the league, and that versus 144 really has changed. Okay. So one might think, oh, does the average of receptions, has that changed? And that's in the next column. And what we really see is it's actually gone down a little bit since 2016. We have had a lower average of receptions. And kind of, if you look, the golden age of tight ends was from about 2009 to 14. Look at the average reception there. Really interesting. And of course, that's why I use colorization of the data, right, to highlight that. So I think that's what's the data is suggesting, is they're starting to split up amongst more tight ends on teams. So that means that tight ends that are heavily used, like the Kelseys and etc., are going to be super premiums. So I argue that because of more tight ends and the pass catching is being split, those that can demand a lot on a team are going to even have more value. So you definitely need to understand that in our, summer analysis for our redraft situations. And I would suspect, obviously, for Dynasty as well. Fantasy points, this is PPR data, is going to be tied to receptions as well. And that's kind of what we're seeing, is the average fantasy points have gone down in the last few years, 2016 to 21. And so that is an issue as well. So I think, again, we're splitting up the show a little bit, and that's costing the average tight end on teams some production and some reception. So just be aware of that. Okay, next slide. Seems a little busy, but hey, you got to have some complexity. So the number of tight ends is represented by the bar graph, just showing the enhancement of tight ends. And we talked about that. The number of fantasy points on this scale, I don't think shows up as much as the reception number. You can see if you just look at the 120 number here, or right here, I guess it's on this scale, that in the last few years we've gone down. Right here, it kind of hit a trough. 2019 was kind of back, but in the last couple. So just be aware of that. And again, I think I've covered that actually in the last, but I like to look at it visually as well there. Okay, so we won't dwell on this too much. So what I do in my database is every year I look at and divide the populations of whatever position into fourths. So you think of it's quarters, right? If you cut the pie into 4 pieces. So you have the top piece, that's where all the action is. The next piece is above average, but not, below 75%. And it's called percentiles. And then below average, we would have 2 pieces. And I like to focus with the top piece, the top players, and you could look 2000 to 2021. The number of tight ends in this top segment actually has gone up. So we got more tight ends, but more are actually ending up in the 75. So some of that could be they've gotten more efficient, teams are using more, but also, see, this is dependent on the population. It's kind of the pie's just got bigger, so there's more tight ends because there's more tight ends. So that it can be a little tricky there. But I think average of receptions can tell us a little more. And in the last few years, we've been below what has gone on from 2016 back to 2009. That was kind of that golden age above 50, 51. And only last year were we near 50%. So, but just be aware that for the average tight end, even in the best ones, the receptions have gone down. Again, there are 2 tight end sets and there are multiple passing tight ends, and that confounds the value we have to estimate. Fantasy points, again, we are not in the best world compared to 2016 back to 2009. That's kind of the golden age, but we're much better than the old days as far as fantasy points. So we're getting fantasy points per tight end average, but we've got more tight ends, and it's not as significant than has been the last few years. So I'm not expecting 2022 to be anything more dramatic than what we've seen before. Here's the receptions across time and the average fantasy points in red, receptions in the blue. And I drew a pink line kind of for us to see a landmark, and we can kind of compare above and below average, and you see the golden age of tight ends 2009 to 16, and we've been in the trough compared to that time, in both fantasy points and receptions. So if you're still remembering tight ends from the, let's call it the good old days, we're not getting as much bang for our buck on average on tight ends. So that's skewing the value of the tight ends. So in the drafts, I think we're coming to the point, and this is called my barbell strategy of drafting, that you're either getting the top one or two that are heavily involved, the Kelsey, maybe the Andrews, starts getting a little thin, maybe Waller, but kind of had a down year, some injury. Logan Thomas when he was healthy, but wasn't healthy. I mean, it gets thin quick on who are the superstars of tight ends. And then you've got kind of the rest. And so since we're then talking about draft value, it's just better to maybe grab two tight ends later if you miss out on the top tight ends. I wouldn't reach for the top tight ends unless it's tight end premium and they're heavily pass catchers. If not, I'm probably delaying my acquisition of tight ends down the road. Okay, so just kind of keep that. And so people talk about late tight end drafting, but we're not like quarterbacks with the late quarterback drafting because of that skew. So I call it the barbell. You're either going high or late, right? Early or late kind of approach, right? You either get up at 6 and get the early bird worm, or you're waiting and having your brunch and slowly waking up from last night's partying, right? So you need to decide kind of how you want to play it, you know, beforehand, right? You don't need to be in the middle of the draft and all of a sudden making that decision. So we'll talk about draft planning, and I don't think people give that enough thinking. And again, where does the draft planning come from? It comes from understanding the landscape, the metrics. So this data you see, I just not present it and throw it away. Okay, it becomes the foundational part of my draft planning. Okay, so you need to take that into account and get with the program. Okay, so you're chopping the wood, you need the good axe, you need the good trees. You know, it needs to be something that can be done in the time, right? Time on task kind of thing. So you need to push yourself a little bit. The last thing here, I just do the age of the tight ends. And we have the number of tight ends over the years. And again, this is over 21 years. The fantasy points, the reception, and I'll talk about the impact value of fantasy points, the IV, here in just a second. So ignore that column. So, age. And we see that the highest number of tight ends that are in the league will tend to be around and peak at 24, 25. So very high. And notice there's a decay rate, and basically by 29, half the tight ends are gone. So there is an attrition rate. 29, certainly by 30, 31. Okay, 31, we're almost a fourth left. So the sands are eroding on all our players' age. Age will take its toll on all of them. Average fantasy points. What was interesting was 19 tight ends were age 21. Very extreme. And because of these guys were put into the league so extreme, they actually tended to produce 63.6 average fantasy points. So these are phenomenal, but they're not very common. So it doesn't happen much. These are the extremes. I don't know if there's any 21-year-old tight ends going to be drafted here in the NFL draft, but if there are, and they have some pedigree, they're worth a second or third look in your dynasty. People forget about that. The peak of fantasy points, well, I know some people say, oh, well, look at 37. Yeah, there's only 9. So in 21 years, there's been 9 players that's made it to 37 years old. So you're getting a very skewed metric there. So I prefer to look around 31 and back, and the peak is at 28 years old. So for Dynasty, to me, 28, 29, 30, 31, even to 33, you're getting production. I mean, you're losing tight ends, but the ones that are still hanging around are getting extra contracts, are really producing. So don't, in Dynasty, if you get rid of the old veteran tight end too quick, you may be losing value here. So I think there's value in older tight ends. It's just, you got to pay attention to injuries and whatnot and how they're used. But unlike running backs, age in tight ends and quarterbacks, we've talked about this same scenario. Some ancient quarterbacks are still, like the Tom Brady's, the Drew Brees, these are still producing way, way down in age, or up in age, I guess I should say. Average receptions, again, the phenoms at 21 years old are extreme. But if you throw that out and then you look at 31 back, 28 is the peak as well. So 28, 29, 30, 31, maybe into 33, we're still finding tight ends. I understand there's, only 50 tight ends have survived to 33, but the ones that have are probably some of the best ones, the ones that really have the great genetics, the great skill sets, just, everything they need to produce for you. So I think there is a misunderstanding about age and tight ends. So in redraft, I'm not shying away from some of the older proven tight ends. I think you're making a mistake. So what does that mean for young tight ends? I think the adage that it takes some seasoning to get the most out of the tight ends is true. The data supports that. They really start coming to their own at 25 and they're peaking at 28, 20. I mean, so that's that optimal. So if I'm Dynasty, I might be looking for early tight ends that people drafted and were disappointed and threw them away, because if they're coming into 25, 26, 27, even 28, it's still possible. There's some goodness there, and some dynasty players may miss that. Okay. The last thing is just something I like to know for myself. I don't think it's very critical, but it explains or tries to quantify the numbers of tight ends per category and compare that to the fantasy. So what happens when you get an extreme number? Look at age 21, you get an 8,600, almost 8,700 number. That's because it's so rare, but they produce so good points for the rarity. The IV is going to be off the charts. Notice when you're getting most of the tight end, the IV is at 400 or less, and it starts building. And notice it, at 28 it's 600, but it's still low. And notice the extremes. When you're getting tight ends, there's only 9 of them at 37. They're at 21,000. That is so rare. it's just telling you those 9 were so extreme. And that's what the impact value is saying, that it is so rare to see these ancient tight ends that theoretically can still produce, that, this is just a way for me to visualize kind of that in my head. Okay. And so here's just the age. I put the purple line for us to look at it. And it pretty much shows the, what is this? This may be a little bit skewed, but this I think is at 29. 28. So I think that number scale should be shifted over. Might be my bad in making the figure there a little bit. Sometimes it's hard. But anyway, there's the peak, and notice that peak stays to 33, 34, maybe in some 30, but it declines at 36. So you're probably not, in Dynasty, this is the age you need to consider getting rid of them. But you have more time than probably people will think. And that could give you an advantage in Dynasty. Some of these old seasoned warriors, people think, oh, they're getting old. Well, people start, oh, they're over 30. That doesn't, it may not mean as much as it ever did, if it ever meant anything at all. So that's my beginning lesson on tight ends. I hope you understand the context, how I use these metrics, and like I said, when we talk about planning your draft lessons later, we'll get into some of this, kind of how we analyze and draft our plans a little bit. Okay, thank you for listening. Please come back. Hopefully this is going to help you become a better fantasy player, and I'm hoping it will inspire you to do your own research. Okay, come back. This is Dr. John Bush for his process. Hope you had fun. Woo woo. I'm having fun.